When the Skylanders franchise began, there were 8 distinctive elements: fire, water, earth, life, air, tech, magic, and undead. These elements of course help the Skylanders differentiate and stand out from one another. But in early 2015, during Trap Team's run, 2 new elements were introduced into the Skylanders franchise, those being the elements of light and dark. This was a great new change to the roster, and it helped diversify it a lot with brand new Skylanders experimenting with abilities of light and dark respectively. But even then, throughout the course of the Skylanders series, only 5 Skylanders each per these elements were ever released, not counting variants. Growing up with the Skylanders franchise, naturally these 2 new elements were very exciting, but by the time they were on shelves, they were completely out of stock, and it only took me until mid-2015 to get my hands on Nightlight. At the time of recording, however, I currently have most of the Dark and Light Skylanders, having 3 of each of these elements. I just don't have a Light and Dark element cores because they're expensive in the aftermarket, and the other 2 Light and Dark senseis I'm just not interested in buying at the minute. Combining both these elements together, and they're a bit of a mixed bag for me. I find that the Light Skylanders have easy to pick up and enjoyable movesets, which is why I love this element so much, while the Dark elements are more combo reliant, and I just find them pretty mediocre. So today, for this pilot episode of Elemental Retrospectives, I'm going to be playing all the current Light and Dark Skylanders I have in my collection and see how I feel about them. And with that, let us start with Skylanders Trap Team.
I'm right, I'm gonna shine like Nightfall.
If you guys knew me for quite some time now, you may already know that we're starting pretty strong here. Nightlight perfectly defines what the light element should be. Starting with this figure, it's one of Skylanders' best in my opinion. The details and the glossy paints on both his wings and his Traptanium, I cannot pronounce that word, made this figure very eye-catching to me. And when my mum found this figure secondhand mid-2015, I cannot tell you how excited I was, and that excitement, for sure, paid off. Nightlight's first attack is seriously overpowered. Being able to swing his, I still cannot pronounce that, so I'm just gonna call it a sword, and it deals knockback damage to enemies. Alternatively, if you hold down the primary attack button, then he can swing around his sword, dealing a lot of damage, which is great for crowd control. While he can easily clear hordes of enemies with his primary attack alone, his secondary and tertiary attacks are just as good. His secondary attack allows him to slow enemies down in its vicinity, which is absolutely perfect when you're being overwhelmed by tougher enemies. His tertiary attack can also allow you to control a beam of light, which again deals knockback damage, and if used wisely, it could completely disrupt an enemy's attack pattern. However, Nightlight did something absolutely revolutionary for any Skylander moveset to come, and that is being able to fly without taking up an attack slot. Instead, all you have to do is to double jump in a single spot. Now, while I'm happy to admit that visibility rectified a serious flaw in many Skylanders, particularly those who were dragons, I will admit that I don't really like using this flying move that much, as it completely reduces his mobility and it's a bit clunky to control. But really, that's about the only negative I can think of Nightlight. Out of all the Skylanders we'll be talking about today, he is my favorite out of all of them. He is an absolute powerhouse of a trap master, and I love him because he was the perfect introduction to not just the light element, but the dark element as well, which is why Nightlight more than deserves his spot in my top 5 Skylanders. Now, does things go downhill from there? No, that would be a bit of an understatement. We're still going to be looking at some really awesome Skylanders, but I will just come clean now and say that Nightlight cannot be topped. But seriously, what is his weapon called? I cannot pronounce that.
You have no business here, Centaur.
Nightmare I got years later after I got back into Skylanders in 2021, so I don't have as fond a connection to her compared to Nightlight. She does definitely have a very cool design for a Trap Master, being a female elf centaur thing with a dark Traptanium lance. Her primary attack, while not dealing knockback damage like Nightlight, is seriously lethal at close range. But if you want to single out a particular enemy, then a secondary attack does the job very well, provided you stand quite a good distance from an enemy and making sure that they aren't attacking you. While these 2 attacks are great, but not the most visually appealing, but that's when her tertiary attack comes in, which I think is the most interesting. If you use your tertiary attack directly on an enemy, then it will create a clone, which will briefly fight for you. On paper that sounds absolutely cool, but in execution, it can be a bit inconsistent and finicky, as sometimes it works perfectly well, and sometimes it doesn't. So you basically have to figure out what enemies work effectively with a Shadow Clone and which ones are practically useless. But at the very least, the Horn does at least briefly stun them, leaving them open to attack for only a brief few seconds. Once again, it's definitely more useful when it comes to taking out larger enemies. Unfortunately, the tertiary attack is completely ineffective against bosses, so in that case, best to just stick with a primary and secondary move. So overall, I do quite like Nightmare. She has an interesting tertiary attack which allows me to experiment and be creative with the way I dispatch enemies, but she just lacks the complete joy I have when I play as Nightlight. And you kind of end up being stuck in a limbo whether you want to always take risks with a tertiary attack, or just clear enemies with the visually less interesting primary and secondary moves. All I can say is that the choice is yours. Skylanders SuperChargers was a bit of an odd time for light and dark elements, because while every other element got at least 2 Skylanders each, one new one and one repo, the light and dark element only got 1 new Skylander each, as well as of course their respective vehicles, but in this series I sadly won't be covering them. But what they lack in numbers, they more than make up with the appearance of the figures, which just look amazing. The metallic paint finishes on the Skylanders, as well as the transparent faces, make them easily 2 of my favorite figures in the entirety of SuperChargers run. A special mention definitely does go to Nightfall, as her hair flows down towards her base, which is something we've never ever seen in Skylanders before, and likely never will again. However, the cool transparent bases do have their downsides, as both the light and dark base have their NFC chip exposed. The one of the light elements manages to cover it a bit better with a glittery paint, but you can still clearly see it. Oh yeah, and another disadvantage about these figures, they're pretty disappointing in game.
My disappointment is immeasurable, and my day is ruined.
Astroblast, oh Astroblast, oh Astroblast. Talking about this Skylander makes me really melancholic. But before I further express apathy to this Skylander, let's talk about the good stuff. His moveset. When fully upgraded, his main attack is absolutely devastating, as in levels such as Babel Island, his lasers can bounce off walls and hit a large number of enemies at the same time. It's not nearly as devastating with areas with little to no walls, but it still gets the job done. But also one of my favorite parts about Astroblast is that you can charge up his main attack and then shoots a bigger laser which deals even more damage, which makes it such a great finishing move, which makes the character more satisfying. But because of how ridiculously ranged his primary attack move is, his secondary and tertiary attack are more close ranged. His secondary move allows him to throw a crystal ball into the sky, which damages the enemy a bit, and he also has a tertiary roundhouse kick move, which does deal knockback damage. I do appreciate the little extra animation of a rainbow being formed when he kicks, as it makes the attack more visually interesting. Additionally, he also has an atom shield, which shields him against other enemies and slightly damages them. And I completely forgot about this move while recording gameplay footage, but if you hold down his tertiary attack button, he can summon a meteor, which is great for crowd control as it damages a lot of enemies in a single area, and if you get his soul gem, it can even summon a sheep to help you fight. Now, you might be wondering, hey, Bionihero, if you're praising his moveset, then why aren't you not very fond of this Skylander? Well, I have to say, it's nothing to do with his moveset, nor his personality. It all really boils down to one simple factor: first impressions. You see, after getting Nightlight, the light element became one of my favorite elements ever, and I was really excited about what SuperChargers will do to continue the concept of light element Skylanders, and when Astroblast was announced, I thought it was the coolest looking SuperCharger out of a whole lot, and I thought that he was going to be my favorite out of all of them. My mum and my sister was having a holiday in Denmark, and my mum got me the Sky Racing pack, which of course included Astroblast, so you could not believe how excited I was. And then when I was trying to open the packet and unboxing Astroblast, his figure broke, so I had to wait for playing with him so that my mum could super glue him back together. But when I did finally play as him, he was abhorrently weak. His primary attack produced a cool sound effect, sure, but it did very little to damage enemies, and I just felt nothing but sheer disappointment. And back then, if there was a Skylander I didn't like, I just didn't bother upgrading them. But when I got back into Skylanders in 2021, I thought I'm gonna give Astroblast another try and upgrade him, and as it turns out, he was extremely powerful and very satisfying to play, but at this point, it was too late. I was generally quite pleased and surprised, but I also thought, man, if only he was that powerful when I first got him. This is ultimately the most depressing thing about Astroblast for me. He could have become my favorite supercharger of all time because he had it all. He was in one of my favorite elements, he had a cool design, and he had such an awesome weapon. But sadly, that was all just the surface. Instead, the title of my favorite supercharger went to Highvolt, who had a completely juxtaposing story. A Skylander who I just randomly bought in Argus thought he had a pretty weird design, but yet when I first played as him, he had an efficient and intriguing moveset, which made me love him from the get-go. Astroblast, on the other hand, is a Skylander that you need to upgrade and play with more in order to fully appreciate him, and I just didn't really have a patience when I was younger. Astroblast is the most disappointing Skylander in my collection. The tragic story I have with Astroblast, and that alone is the reason why Astroblast is, at the time of recording, my least favorite light Skylander. I was hoping that Astroblast was going to ride off the love I had for Nightlight and be just as good as, if not better than him, but as fate will have it, it was just not to be. And hence why I display such bitterness towards this Skylander even to this day.
Death walks among us.
And now for a Skylander who is much less disappointing, but still not the best. I couldn't find this Skylander anywhere when I was a lot younger, but this was because the figures were affected by a problem with the NFC chips, where they weren't reading to the Skylander SuperChargers game, so all figures had to be recalled. And years later, while I was always quite fond of her design, ultimately it was her characterization in the comics that drove me to purchase her. So this led me to the final thing, moveset. She's fine. Easily the most memorable thing about Nightfall in-game is how uniquely animated her hair is. I love how it kind of drags along like if it's some sort of paintbrush. But looks could only get you so far. Her primary attack is serviceable. One thing I learned while doing this recording session is that you can actually jump and still use a primary attack mid-air, which is honestly quite helpful for dispatching bigger enemies who may not have a mid-air attack of any sort. Her secondary attack can allow her to dive into the ground and shoot mini dark particles at other enemies. While it only really does chip damage, at the very least it's great when you're stuck in a tight corner with loads of enemies. Her tertiary attack is not really the best, but at the very least it does do knockback damage, which helps you single out another enemy so that you can deal with another. However, I do quite love the look of attack because the same aquatic blue color is used, which gives off quite a bioluminescent vibe to Nightfall's character. Nightfall is alright. Fundamentally, she's worse than Astroblast, but I would much prefer to put her over Astroblast because the disappointment is not nearly as severe as his. And like the former, I have a feeling that with upgrades she will get a lot more powerful and a lot better as a Skylander. Additionally, I also think Nightfall's design is visually more striking as a supercharger than Astroblast, as her teal and purple color scheme mixed along with her reptilian-like design really makes her more fitting as a sea vehicle pilot, which at the very least makes her visually distinct compared to the rest of her dark element compadres. Compare that with Astroblast, whose signature weapon is a crystalline laser pistol, which is cool and all, but do you know what other Skylander uses laser-based abilities?
My file name is Humanoid Simulation XL5769222. But you can just call me Simeon.
One of the most genius things about Skylanders Imaginators roster is that they allowed one villain from Skylanders Trap Team to return as a Skylander Sensei. And picking all the fan-favorite villains from Skylanders Trap Team made it all the more better, even if some baffling elements changes were to be made. And lucky for me personally, two of my favorite villains from Trap Team became Skylander Senseis. And obviously we're gonna start with a better one of the two. Blaster-Tron. I literally couldn't fathom how excited I was to see Blaster-Tron return as a Skylander in Imaginators. And having him finally as a Skylanders figure outside of a light trap was just glorious. And even though his theme song isn't nearly as good as the one in Trap Team, Blaster-Tron's moveset improved tenfold and made me absolutely love the light element again. His primary attack is a very fun and destructive one, simultaneously able to damage enemies close range as well as long range thanks to the lasers produced from the sword. But also if you hold down his primary attack button, he can do a very destructive laser attack, which kills off pretty much any weaker enemies in your vicinity. Although he can have a blast get it with his primary attack alone, his other two moves are just as powerful and addictive. He can fire a shield which can severely damage enemies, but also if you hold down the secondary button, he can also shield himself. Since the shields slow the enemies inside and down, it can help you take on a bigger enemy and focus on them instead. His tertiary attack is a nice expansion to the design of his jetpack, as when you fire it, but I get the most fun out of his tertiary attack by combining it with his secondary attack, as when his missiles are shot into the shield, and then when you use a tertiary attack, it splits into many miniature rockets, which locks onto an enemy. His Sky-Chi move is very weird, he just turns slightly big, but I absolutely love that Pacific Rim joke. Blaster-Tron, what more do I really need to say here? Blaster-Tron is easily my favorite sensei, not just because I absolutely love the character, but also to me personally, he's an accurate representation of what I feel are the strongest aspects of the Imaginator Sensei roster, being a complex and fun Skylander at the same time. Which is sadly the complete opposite of the level I stupidly chose to do this recording session. Will you two please shut up?
I know. Hufflepuff.
Here's an interesting fact I really want to share with you guys about Sickle. He's actually my first Dark Skylander, and I got him at around 2018. I have heard recently that he had received quite the spike in value. It does help that Sickle is another iconic villain in Trap Team, but I'm not too sure £40 is an actual reflection of the quality of this Skylander. As a Skylander, Sickle is pretty good, but when you compare that to his moveset in Trap Team, and it was a slightly degrading experience for me. Sickle's main attack is pretty good, but just lacks that absolute power that the original moveset has had. His dash attack is good if you want to quickly travel from one place to another, and it also forms two dark orbs which can also fuse with his side, which not only makes his primary attack more appealing to watch, but also gives this light damage increase. Sickle's tertiary attack is summoning a black hole, which is something a previous Dark Skylander, Blackout, already did. It can slow enemies down when they touch it, but what I find more interesting is that if you swing your scythe above a black hole, then it also spawns some miniature scythes, which fly all over the place. I only just recently discovered that technique, but it's such a good move to use when you're literally surrounded by lots of enemies. Those miniature scythes do chip damage, but they produce at such a fast rate that it's pretty destructive. His Sky-Chi move is a little bit uninspired, but it does do a lot of knockback damage to enemies, so it's okay. The main problem I have with this Skylander is that it's a bit too drastically different to the original Sickle. His artwork and figure features scales on his hood for some reason. His voice is also completely different too, and while it's not entirely the worst, it makes him sound more like a teenager who just wants to slack off than a daunting and chilling figure who I come to expect Sickle to be. Trap Team Sickle was like stepping into the shoes as the Grim Reaper. Up close and personal with enemies, he deals over 700 damage, and it felt like I was taking the souls from those enemies. That for me was just so satisfying. With Imaginators Sickle, I don't know. I just feel very conflicted about this Skylander. Out of all the Sensei villains who had their elements changed, Sickle's one made sense the most. Sickle was always this dark and shadowy Skylander, and there's nothing really specifically undead about him, except that his ghost effects are the same ones that Cinder and Ghost Roaster uses, and replacing them with blue glowing orbs was definitely a welcome change. But because of the many additional moves used into Sickle's moveset, I felt that a lot of his identity was taken away, and while both he and Blaster-Tron were forced into a battle class, the changes made were still executed a lot better. His sword still shoots a barrage of lasers, and his other additional moves made him come across as a Skylander who came from the future and has this advanced technology which he puts to good use to take down enemies. And his voice, which is pretty much the reason why people love Blaster-Tron in the first place, is still the same as it was in Trap Team. Blaster-Tron's Sensei moveset felt like an upgrade. With Sickle, a lot of the aspects that made him so memorable in the first place are just simply not present anymore, and as a result I feel I'm playing as a completely different character. The light and dark element were a very curious part of Skylanders history, and in fact I quite enjoyed replaying a lot of these Skylanders. In fact, dare I say, I even have a newfound appreciation for the dark element, even though I still prefer the light element in comparison. None of these Skylanders are found to be outright terrible. 2 of them are extremely disappointing, 2 of them are good, and 2 of them are in my top 20 favourite Skylanders of all time. Sadly, with that said, I have to draw this video to a close. But what are your personal favourite light and dark Skylanders? I'm open to any opinions. Like, comment, and subscribe. And I'll see you all in the next video.